Um, so thank you all for coming tonight. I'm Rob Saunders, the Executive Director and Curator of Waterfront Archive, and we're very happy to welcome R.J. Andrews tonight. There are a couple of things that I think are really special about R.J. and I have kind of bonded over a particular behavior, which is collecting things that inspire our practice. So that's kind of what the Letterform Archive started as, was
Have a good night.
Collection for their own inspiration. The stuff on the table back there, you might think it's in the archive. We kind of wish it was. It's not. This is RJ's collection. And the things that he's going to be talking about are mostly on this table. Please have a look. Don't touch the old stuff. The new stuff is a series of 3 books that he kickstarted. And they're wonderful. And we can also bond over that, because Kickstarter books is a thing, and we've both done it. So RJ has a book called Info We Trust, in addition, and a website called Info We Trust, in addition to the Kickstarter books, and an active practice as an information graphics designer. One of the things on his resume is the White House, and I asked him a little while ago what that was, and it was a graphic dashboard for, currently I'm not in the Zoom frame. There we go. A graphic dashboard for the COVID crisis, which you did daily. And it was on the table in the equivalent of the Situation Room or whatever. So that's just one kind of intense piece of RJ's practice. Please welcome RJ Reynolds.
So when we think about data visualization and data graphics, one of the things we should always think about is time, because from a certain point of view, data visualization was invented, as much as it was invented, to understand time, and to understand time as well as we understand space using geographic maps. And so one of the most beautiful metaphors for time ever illustrated is The Temple of Time by Emma Willard. How many people have seen this before? Hands up. It's about maybe a quarter of the room. And so what you see is the Temple of Time. Each column represents a century, and the more distant columns, as you peer down the temple, is more distant history, and there's less detail. It's blurrier. This metaphor for time really mirrors our actual experience of time very well. That the recent past is much more clear than the distant past. And can we see the future? No, none of us can see the future. Our back is to the future, but we can peer back into history. One of the many details about this that I love is that it was published in 1846 in the middle of the 19th century. And you can see that the 19th century columns are only half constructed. And so it shows that time continues, marches forward, and you could actually extend this temple another column and a half, right, into where we are today. So my name's RJ. I'm a practicing information designer, and this is Glorious Data Graphics. I'm going to spend the next hour or so sharing some of the data graphics that I really love. When I think about glorious data graphics, I think of things that are intensely delightful, things that are inspiring, things that are splendid in beauty or richness, things that deserve renown. So we're going to see some things that are happy. We're going to see some things that are sad, because the truth of the matter is, just like my work with COVID-19, data visualization is sometimes at its very best when it's depicting horror, when it's depicting health crises, when it's depicting war. So some of you saw the Emma Willard graphic. I promise you that most of you, maybe none of you, have seen the next piece, because this is a discovery. So let's talk about grids. So who knows what this is about? Nobody, right? There's no letters. So we're at the Letterform Archive, and so I have to highlight that while visual forms are beautiful, and that's what we love, that they are meaningless without type. You need letters to understand what's going on. This is by a contemporary. of Emma Willard, a woman named Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. How many people know this graphic? Nobody. How many people went to kindergarten? Everybody went to kindergarten, right? Everybody who at least grew up in the United States went to kindergarten. And you can thank Peabody for that. So she imported kindergarten from Germany in the middle of the 19th century. She imported something else, which was, from my perspective, a really wild and crazy way of depicting history. And so let me just add a little bit of context, which she would have given you if she was giving this to you, which is that each one of these blocks is a year. Each row is a decade, and we go through year by year by year by year. Okay, so let's focus on a single block. Let's look at 1801, and you can see that 1801 is further subdivided into 9 squares. And each square represents, a particular type of historic event. And you can see that all the squares are colored and have different designs, and the colors represent different nations, different geographies. And so this is a way of compressing an enormous amount of information about what went on. And just knowing that, you can see things like the wild revolutions of 1848 and, in 1814, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, right? And so this, like I said, is a discovery. Peabody published the method she imported from Poland. And so we know what it was like, but she referenced this big wall chart that she would fold out to try to explain it to people. And until about a month ago, everybody assumed that this wall chart didn't survive, but it did survive. And I say it's a wall chart because if you think that this is crazy, okay, and this thing's enormous. So it's nearly as tall as the average American woman. This is half of the presentation. I don't know where the other half is, but there's a pre-Christian era, an ancient history that would have gone with this. So we have grids. Only a couple decades later, we had this presentation of different types of data about the population of Paris. Ages and professions and anything you could think of. And there's 40 maps. And here's some of what the maps looked like. And each map was different, what it was about, but it looked the same. And that they used the same base map and they hand colored the maps differently to represent the intensity of whatever value they were showing. And at the very end of this publication, they provided a summary table that looks like this. This is one of the items that's in the back of the room. And what you have is the arrondissements, all the different neighborhoods of Paris going vertically. So you took like kind of a snail shell and unwrapped it, right? And then you have the different maps, all 40 going from left to right. And this is, it's quite beautiful, but also it's a milestone in data graphics because this is the very first shaded table, at least the first shaded table that we know about. And so, I showed you how big Peabody was. We should show you how big this is. Here's a banana for scale. So we're going to go through and look at a couple different types of data graphics. I want to show you a few time graphs, not line graphs, but a particular type of line graphic, a line graph that's used to really, really emphasize time. Again, data graphics are used to tell us all about time. And so late 1860s and going on for the next decade or so, there's just like enormous feats of adventure in ballooning. And in France, particularly, and also here in America, this is from James Glacier's book about some of his adventures. And what you see here on the vertical axis is the altitude, the height above land. And you can see a little cartoon balloon go across the landscape from the beginning of its voyage all the way to the end. And before we start moving, I want you to note like that odd scale on the left in feet. And so we'll travel with the balloon and we'll go up and we'll go down and we'll go through the clouds and we'll see that we're at midnight and we have sunrise and like, wait, did they sail through the night? Yeah, they flew through the night. And what did that look like? Well, the book showed us what it looked like. It looked something like this. Is that wonderful? But that's not all. Because if we zoom out on the entire graphic, you can see that the reason the scale is so funny on the left is because actually it's in meters on the right. And so you have the height of the balloon. You have some sort of sense of the experience of the balloon from the illustrated clouds. You have the terrain that they're flying over and where all the little towns and cities are. And then on the bottom, you actually have the actual route and the map that you're flying from. And then finally, you have an idea of like when night is by that shaded graph. Now, this is a really beautiful composition. But what's amazing about this is that this was a type, and that there's dozens and dozens and dozens of these produced with Gaston de Sandier, who was a French aeronautical adventurer. And this is another diagram. Sandier would often do this sort of like inverted color palette. And this is the one of his most famous voyages where they're going for the altitude record, and they went all the way up, and everybody passes out. They lose control of the balloon. They lose control. They pass out, right? And by the time they land, he's the only survivor, and his two colleagues die. And so there's dozens and dozens of these explaining, these balloon exploits. You can see way down here on the lower right, you can see the Loire Valley, right? Just like kind of niched into the landscape. The next time graph I want to show you is all about political parties in the United States. And what you're going to see as we move across is you're going to see how, presidents of one party or another rise or fall, and there's these little splinter parties. And I mean, so far I'm talking a lot about content and what they're showing, but really what I want to press upon you is something that my friend Zoe says, like vibes, right? There's like, look at the vibes of this. Like, look at the colors and the different typefaces and how everything is swoopy. And there's so much going on, but it all hangs together and just all hangs together so well. And so here we are in the 1830s. If you know American history, things start to get a little chaotic politically, don't they? And we're going through the 1840s, and before you'd say, well, it looks like rivers, and here you say, well, no, it looks like snakes, doesn't it? And then finally, we hit the Civil War. And so moving from this political timeline, I think we're going to slow down a little bit and actually explain how to read a chart, because the next one deals directly with the Civil War. And so I want everybody in the room just to read this for a moment. And so right in the middle, you see Gettysburg, and you can see a time scale on the vertical. So just take a moment with it. So often when we think about time moving from left to right. Why is that? Well, we read books left to right. Why is that? Well, most people are dominant right-handed, and if you write, right to left, like all the ink smudges, right? If you're writing with your right hand, supposedly pre-ink languages, was different because you're chiseling with a hammer. It's actually easier to move in the opposite direction. But here, time doesn't move from left to right. Here, time moves, as it often does now in data journalism, vertically. Why? Because right now we have scrolling metaphors, right? And so we're back to scrolls. Here, time moves vertically with the distant past at the bottom, and we move forward as we look up the page. So that's one axis. That's the vertical axis. We might call that the independent axis. And so let's look at the other axis. What's happening here? Well, we're looking at space, and we're looking at a one-dimensional compression of the entire United States into one dimension. And you have the northern states all the way on the right, and you have the southern states all the way on the left. So you can almost think of this as the eastern seaboard, where you have sort of Maine all the way to the right. You have Florida all the way to the left. And then what you have, again, this is a graphic about the Civil War, is you have troop movements, okay? And so you have troop movements, you have where corps are, and you can see the Confederate Army making this attack and making this northern push And where are they confronted? At Gettysburg. Now, sort of similar to the Peabody that we saw earlier, this is just the detail. And so this style of chart is called a synoptical chart. Synoptical because it's a synopsis, it's a summary. And you can see here the titles for the horizontal axis. You can see we have northern states going all the way down to southern states. And you can see the flow of different armies moving and fighting. And then, like, similar to that, the political timeline that we saw, there's all sorts of annotation explaining this battle, and this is where this general took over. And like the accessory information is even added onto that because you actually have the value of the Union currency on the right and the Southern on the left. You zoom all the way out, and you can get a sense, a feel, a synoptical feel for what the war, what actually happened, where were there intense periods of conflict. I mean, it's a crazy chart. It's a crazy composition. This is not something that, could be made today, honestly. Most of these things couldn't be made today. And why is that? What have we lost? I think the big thing we've lost is canvas size. Like all of these items are really, not all of them, but many of these items are really big, right? And when something is really big, you can just cram quite a lot of information into it. But, what walks hand in hand with canvas size is that, because it's really big, there's a lot of information there. And like that requires patience from your reader, right? The reader actually has to give some attention and engage with it and spend time first to just, understand how to read this thing, but then actually, engage with the piece. And, all of these sort of have a particular vibe. One thing that's common amongst almost all of them, except for the balloon piece, is that, they're very, very colorful. And, this is something that I think we've also, sort of gotten away from, unfortunately, is how do you not go for 2 or 3 colors? How do you combine 8 colors, successfully, like in a really attractive way? Maybe not just generally across society, but like particularly with information design. We have a particular aesthetic now that it's sort of like, let's put a lot of distance between everything so that we can get people scrolling and see more ads, right? And that's sort of like this minimal, sort of like tons of negative space aesthetic. There's not a whole lot of negative space throughout any of these, but it doesn't really bother me too much. Let's look at charts that go around in a circle, just like this. And so, how many people have seen this before? A couple of people have seen this before. This might be my favorite thematic map of all time. It was by Émile Chesson, and Chesson was a civil engineer. He worked he worked for the French government. And if you've heard of Charles Joseph Menard and his famous March on Moscow, Napoleon's March on Moscow, Chesson is sort of the inheritor of that Menard tradition of making not only flow maps, but just really, really beautiful data graphics, usually related to civil engineering. Where are we going to build the next railroad line? Things like that. Chesson looked after 18 volumes that were published over 25 years in France. And what's really interesting about these volumes is that year to year, they would repeat many graphics, updating it with the next year of data. And that tells you a lot because you can see from one year to the next what changed, how their design improved. And these are normally not rote graphics because they're still very attractive, but they're more useful than the graphic you're looking at now. They actually had some sort of bureaucratic purpose. Often, though, in these albums, they would slide in 1 or 2 one-offs, 1 or 2 kind of weird maps or weird charts that they didn't repeat. And this is one of those. And so what we're looking at here is an album that came out in 1890 that had a couple graphics celebrating the just completed Universal Expo, the World Expo, which had just been completed. And what you see here is different theaters in Paris, each represented by their own graphic, by their own kind of like mini chart. And what's neat is that each chart is located about where the theater is. And so you can see that most clearly in the top left with the Opera House. You can see the opera is actually on the opera. As you go around each individual chart, you can see that these wedges get bigger or smaller. And how are they fluctuating? They're fluctuating by ticket sales. So, how popular was this theater? And you can see that 2 years on either end are distinguished by a gold color. They're not red. Like, why is that? Well, these are the outlier years. These are the years that there was a Paris Expo. And so you have, these outlier years distinguished in gold, but that's not the only way that they're distinguished. And, some of you, up front can probably see this a little bit easier, but there's also a dashed line that runs through all of the red wedges. And so there's a summary value, an average value for all the red wedges, but they're really sure to not include the outlier years in that summary value. And so you can see all kinds of things in this chart. In this view, what you can see is, when certain theaters were founded, right? So I really like the visual metaphors in this chart. The fan is really beautiful because it focuses attention to a single point in a way that a bar chart, wouldn't as well. But it still preserves that time metaphor of moving left to right. You have the distant past on the left, the more recent past on the right. Aesthetically, what I really love about this is that the red is so bold and so beautiful, but you can still look right through it and see the base map, like right underneath it, in a way that, again, today is, not easy to pull off. The other thing to, I think, admire about this is again, the lettering is how all of these years are not only labeled as they rotate all the way around each of these fan charts, but actually change in size, depending on the chart they're showing. This is just a detail, and we move out, and you can see that. You can see not only this like center core of Paris, but you can see that they also have some theaters that didn't fit on the map, right? They're off the map, but they're still important, and so they're going to bring them onto the map. And then in addition to that, we also have this summary chart. There's sort of like this, this horrible critique, like it should have been a bar chart, right? And they sort of head that off at the pass by, well, here's the bar chart of like similar data. And so you have, you have the totals as a bar chart, and you can see those outlier years. But you can see here there's 4 outlier years. And so what's so nice about the bar chart is they're actually able to extend the time scale and show you like the whole history and the rise. And you can see each individual Paris Expo, which happens about every decade or so. You can also see the dip in the middle of the bar chart. Anybody know what that is? World War II. So this chart was created in 1890. And so that dip is happening, 15 years or so previous, a dozen years previous, in fact. No. So this is the Franco-Prussian War. And the connection between the connection between this and Menard is that the siege of Paris during that war is what forces him at age of 89, first to make the Napoleon chart as a statement of anti-war protest, and then B, forces him to flee Paris and die only weeks later on his way to Burgundy. So one of my favorite circles, bars that go around a circle composition. We're going to jump forward a few more decades to look at another really incredible piece. So this is one of the charts that has like a title that's a million miles long. Sometimes when we really care about vibes, you almost don't care what the content is, because you're so enamored by how they're showing, what they're showing. But this is showing a ratio, sort of what percent, and it's a average cost of service, and each bar represents a different state. And you can see that these states are organized by a particular value, the value in gold, which is the percent of increase in average cost of service for salaried employees. And so that's sort of like what's chosen. And is anybody getting the Moire effect with this? This is actually a piece that's very difficult to show digitally sometimes because you get like a Moire effect by its fill patterns. And so using only 2 inks, but different fill patterns, they're creating lots of texture and lots of like little like distinctions as you move, you know, from this like dark gold all the way to sort of a light yellow. The other thing that this has that's similar to the Paris chart is it has these nice summary lines, both for the gold and for the silver bars, which represent the percent of increase in average cost of service for wage earners. I really like this chart also because of the little cutout for Nevada, which is the only piece that had a decrease. Mm-hmm. And so you can see that all the way at the bottom. Like many of the other charts we've seen, this is also a detail view. And we pull back and we can see things, you know, in this abstract kind of chart organized by value, you know, who's the best, who's the worst, sorry, Nevada. But then you can also see it geographically, right? And it's sort of this idea of there's always, you know, different ways to see information. You know, sometimes there's better ways to see information for different purposes. And, you know, we don't always have to choose one way or the other. You know, when we have a beautiful book that we can fold open and give people a chart, give them a map, and then also, well, you know, if you want, here's the data, right? And the data is presented not like as a CSV you can download and go see yourself, like it's actually presented in a way that's very consumable. You know, you don't always have to choose. So my friend Jason Forrest, you know, first called my attention to not just this work, but the people who made this work. And so this was created by the National Industrial Conference Board. Does that resonate with anybody? It's an organization that still exists. They've trimmed the National Industrial off, and now they're just known as Conference Board. This is from 1923, just a little over 100 years ago. And it's part of a volume that has lots and lots and lots of beautiful charts. And here's a picture of the team that made it. And the lady in the very back corner, that's Paulette LaCour Leiden. And later she stylized herself as just Pole, with a circumflex over the O. And so I think this photo is from maybe like slightly later, but this is she was chief chartist. Okay, so we used to have chartists. We also used to have chartography. Like when people think of bar charts and line graphs and pie charts, how many people think of that as data visualization? Does anybody use any other terms for it than data visualization? I've we've titled this data graphics, this presentation. I've taken this saying data graphics instead of data visualization because I find the word visualization to be a mouthful, both to read and to say. But data visualization is a digital artifact. You know, before 1980 or so, it didn't really exist. So here's Pole and some of her fellow chartists, you know, working at their, and you know, just I mean, imagine being there and making, you know, dozens and dozens of these, and you know what you see in frame is like these huge wall charts. It's just very exciting. This is 1923. I just want to go back again, and you know, when you see it, you know, everybody in the room, when you see it in person, I mean, this is a thoroughly modern sort of composition, thoroughly sophisticated. And again, the attention with the type and labeling everything, you know, I mean, this is laid out by hand, right? I mean, it's really impressive. I at the same time that Polat Leiden was making this, there was something really exciting happening in Istanbul. Has anybody ever seen this before? This is the cover of the Journal of Justice, and it's from this one in particular. I forget exactly when it's from, but they had these data graphic covers that were published from maybe 1923, 1924 for several years. And I worked on translating this. This is not Arabic. This is actually like a Turkish dialect. So it's not, can anybody read this in the room? No, I can't either. Before I move on, because there are more of these that I want to show you, and one of these I do understand what it's all about. But before we move on to this, I mean, there's a couple of things to appreciate. Is that these are not going around in a circle; these are going around in an oval to fit the trim size of the cover. You can see like all of the bars are actually angled in, right? And so there's like a slight sort of like almost, you know, if you look at it in a certain way, it's almost like a perspective effect, right? But the thing that's like most crazy is that one of these values is so much bigger than everything else. And I don't know what it is, but it goes all the way up and then it hits the title block, and then it just curves around, you know, counterclockwise. So I mentioned this is just one of many of these. So here are three others. And so you have another sort of like oval situation with a crazy line graph in the middle on the left. And then the one on the right we can spend a minute with. Let's look at that one. So what is this? The spider web, right? Okay, so this is the Journal of Justice was, I mean, we might call it like sort of a woke publication. But this is a graphic about the prison industrial complex, okay? And so what you're looking at is how many people are incarcerated. And this grid is split into three sections, and the three sections are the type of incarceration, all right? So in one section, you have people who are in prison, and next you have people who are rowing, and the third one is people who are confined to a fortress. So you have three different sections, then there's subsections for the actual sentences. You know, you're sentenced for this amount of time or this type of hard labor, et cetera, et cetera. So already the visual metaphor of the spider web and using the spider web as graticule and like it's already like, I think like kind of like wonderful and crazy. But then like, what are all these dots, right? And normally what you'd think is that these dots are, you know, on some sort of like scale. And maybe it's a linear scale or a log scale, but like the position of the dot corresponds to how many people have this particular sentence. And that's not quite true. And so I can explain how to read these dots. Is that here's a particular sentence and it's represented with 4 dots. And each dot represents a unit place. And so you have at the very top, a single dot in the 1/1000th place. And then the next, you have a dot in the 9/100th place on down, a dot in the 2/10s place, and then finally an 8 in the, do you see all these like different scales? Like, yeah, like really like everyone 1 to 9, 1 to 9, 1 to 9, 1 to 9. And so when I think about data graphics from history, in his introduction, Rob talked about having a library and using a library as a working practitioner. I consider, my library as a designer's library. It's something that I'm constantly pulling off the shelf and looking at, well, how did they solve this problem? And, the past is full of so many attempts at solving information design problems, information design challenges. And what's great is you can look at the way people did things and sometimes find, oh, like I can use that. But so often you find things that are just like, well, that's probably a dead end. Like that's probably something that like I'm never going to do. It's not that everything in history is perfect. No, they're just as they're just as myopic as we are today, right? But what's interesting is that they're myopic in a particular context. They had certain data and they had certain audiences and certain challenges and certain means of production that we just don't use. And so the solutions that these people arrived at um, are so different often from the natural solution that we arrive at. That's the Journal of Justice. They're not very big. So starting around the same time in the 1920s, there was a man in Vienna named Otto Neurath who started doing really fantastic stuff with pictorial symbols. And he cobbled together sort of a troupe of people, including Gerd Ernst and Marie Reidmaster, who would eventually become his wife. And so Marie Neurath outlived Otto and went on to lead these troupe of pictorial symbol magicians. And so what I'm going to show you next is one of the pieces that came out after Otto's death that was made by Marie, and it's one of my favorite data graphics. And this is I want you to savor how charming this is. So this is called The Ocean Shrinks. It came out during the war in 1943. And so what you have is the East Coast of America on the left and England on the right. This is from a series of publications titled Only an Ocean Between. And it was all about good vibes between Great Britain and America. Again, this is coming out in 1943. It's like, hey, America, we need your steel, we need your troops, right? What's really interesting is that there was a parallel publication, similar format, about the good vibes between Great Britain and Russia. And it turns out the person behind that publication was a Russian spy. But that's also interesting. And these are loaded with these types of pictorial graphics. And so we see the ocean shrinks from 1800, 1838 to today. And today represented by, well, in 1943, you had some options on how you could get from Great Britain to America. There's a couple of details here. One is just like the colors. Like the colors are just perfect, right? You have this red, blue, gray, and just everything just hangs so nicely. This is a full spread on an open book, and you can see that it's not centered on the gutter, right? So even though it lays flat, it's just shifted just a little bit so that that center line isn't interrupted by the gutter, which I really like. Let's look at some details. So the star of the show is the vehicle, right? And I love that the vehicle is in that eye-catching red, but it's not the same vehicle, like it changes. And so the mark, there's a certain consistency to the mark, but there's also a lot of detail, and there's a story in the mark itself. And similar to how the vehicle changes, the cityscapes are changing too, right? And so you can see kind of the evolution to what looks like just any old town to, oh, that's obviously Manhattan. There's like nothing else that could be. In the same way that the one on the right is obviously London. And so this, it's a cartoon, right? Like it's really a diagram, or is it? Like, is there data here? And yeah, like if you read the fine print, then you'll see that each wave represents a single day of travel. And so it's like, it is sort of like a centered bar chart that is just shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until you have, a day on an airplane, right? Probably hopping from Great Britain to, I don't know, Greenland and then Canada and like all the way down. So I asked you to savor this one and how, yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was just curious, do you think there's any intention with the direction of travel of the vehicle?
Oh, yeah, I think that's interesting. If you're in Great Britain and you're producing this, to try to foster good relationships across the pond, then, maybe there is this sort of like happy kind of like, don't come over here for like tourism, like you're the destination, right? And so maybe it's honoring America a little bit. That's possible. Also, like in 1943, like you probably don't want to be sailing toward Europe. So maybe that's it too. I don't know. Yeah, interesting. Like we'd have to look at like all the other graphics, and we could do that afterward to see if there's like any sort of other sort of like subtle intentionality. of going from one to the other. But also like historically, like in 1800 and 1838, there's one direction where all the people are like flowing, right? Like there's mass immigration to America. From not only from London, but from Europe generally. And so there's also like maybe if you're trying to tell a historic story, that's the way that you tell the story. So maybe it's that too. It could be a lot of things, and that's like the great thing about data graphics is like you can really or any pictures like you can pack in a lot of like subtle context and things that are people can interpret in different ways. So depending on who you are, you might read it a little bit differently, and subconsciously, and it might make you feel a certain way. I want to show you. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think there's anything interesting about the dash between 2 and 8?
Oh, I think that's probably just so I don't know. I would guess that's some sort of like aspect of just how today may have been written or could have been written at the time. Maybe it's British. Maybe it's a British today. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So I think it's a really charming graphic, and I wanted to emphasize and savor this before we see the next one, because the next one is a really sad graphic, but done in a very similar style. So this is in Greek. This came out just a couple years later, immediately after World War II ended. And what you see is the diet of the average working class family in Athens. And you can see a timeline, a very crude timeline, from 1939, just as the war starting, to 1941, 42, and then 1943. And what it's showing you is that it's showing you that people are starving. It's not just some people are starving. It's showing you at a certain point in the war, everybody's starving. There's no food. And so a little bit of context about this graphic is it comes from a very large format book, which was an international plea by Greece for support. And the book goes through, here's how all of our infrastructure was destroyed. Here's how we lost everything. Here's how all the people that we lost. And it goes through and catalogs with data the absolute ransack of Greece by the Axis powers. And the one thing that I'm not going to show you, but that is the prime feature of this, is that right now, sort of like in COVID, and you hear, there's so many thousand people who died in New York City, and it's like, well, that sounds bad. And then you just like saw a photo of like the mass graves are digging, and you're like, oh. And so there's a certain quality of knowledge and information that a data graphic can give you, this kind of eye in the sky summary statistic that's important, and it's important to understand that, but sometimes it can lose the emotional punch. This is actually part of a much larger composition. And so what I'm not going to show you is when you turn the page, and then you turn the next page, and you turn the next page, what you see are photographs. And the photographs are all of photographs of Greeks who just collapsed in the street because they starved to death. And so again, if you're in the room, we can take a look at that after the trial. I don't want to broadcast it across Zoom because it's quite troubling photographs, but it really lands a punch because you get this idea of sort of like the eye in the sky, but also boots on the ground, the top down and the bottoms up. You get the summary statistic and you get the emotional human connection to somebody's gaunt face, just skin and bones. It reminds me of this experience. Rob introduced this COVID work I did. There was a certain point where I was tracking sort of like when remdesivir, I don't know if you remember, like remdesivir, was being used to try to, help people who are diagnosed with COVID. And at a certain point, we're actually tracking every person who's getting remdesivir. And my wife, who's a physician at UCSF, she's working as a COVID doc. I remember I was driving her over to the hospital one morning, and one of her patients had been put on remdesivir. And I was like, oh my gosh, like they're one of my dots. Because at a certain point, it was so few people, like it was a few hundred people, it's like not many, like it was such a small scale, but I had this very, again, eye in the sky, distant sort of, behind a spreadsheet, view of things where she saw the human face. who is actually getting the drug. And, it was a moment for us to, connect, have a really sort of somber connection. I have, I think, 2 more graphics before we like open up to a broader discussion. And so I want to like at least pay homage to where we are today. And so let's take a step toward the digital. And so I'm going to show you something again from, man, maybe there's too much France in this. I'm going to show you something. It's a graphic about America, but it was first presented at the Pompidou Center in Paris. And I'm going to show you as a film because that's the only way that we can show it to you in this format. Okay, but so it's a short film, and it's sort of like well, let's just take a look. And so we have America, and we have time marching on, and you see this sort of like I don't know, this sort of like cancer taking over America. And what is that? Well, it's people. But so here's the population centers, right? And you can see the city populations rising and spiking. And it's spinning. Why is it spinning? So we have a film of what this experience was sort of like. But how it was actually presented was as a hologram. And so this is a cylindrical hologram. And you would start at a certain point in the hologram, and you'd see, I forget exactly when it starts, but I think the first census, which is 1790. And then you would walk around the cylinder, and as you walked around and looked into the cylinder, the map would change. And so as you moved around, you would see different history. And so this is part of a famous exhibition by Jacques Bertin, who was responsible for a lot of the sort of foundational, I guess, digital or just pre-digital ideas about how to encode data, particularly how to encode data in maps. And so he did this big exhibition at the Pompidou Center, and this particular hologram is by Geoffrey Dutton. Again, 1978, right? So we're drifting into digital. And so the last graphic I want to show, and this is one that I don't know if you want to savor, but I believe it's incredibly joyous. So this is from a decade later, and this is a chart created with a Windows 1 program called micrographics. Anybody use micrographics ever? Windows 1, and we can kind of like, yeah, I see somebody on Zoom is laughing, and I think it's good to laugh. And I think that this might be one of those compositions where it kind of like goes all the way around the curve, where it's like so bad and it breaks so many rules and it's so horrific that it has actually become something that's just almost magical, right? But putting a red summary line over a yellow curve, over a magenta, reference fill, 3-dimensional. And it's just like sort of like quite a lot at once. And when I discovered this graphic, like this is something that it's like holy crap. But then like you actually look at the aesthetic as we've gone back to like sort of 1980s, right? In the last half decade or so, it's like actually this could sort of fly. Okay, so that's micrographics. That's the last example I have tonight. We've gone through about a century and a half of history. These are only a dozen or so examples. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of examples, but these are the ones that I believe each one of these is glorious in their own way, both from a sort of a story and why they're created, how they're created, but also just the aesthetic quality that they bring, just like the way that they make you feel, especially when you see them in person. And so everybody in the room, thank you so much for actually coming here. It's really, really fun that we get to do this. And so you get a treat that like all of these are actually in the back of the room. So you can go check them out. And we're going to do that after Q&A, and we'll give like kind of a little bit of a tour. And then people in the room and also people online. I make all kinds of books about information graphics and other items. And so you can use that link to, learn a little bit more about Visionary Press and some of that work. And with that, Rob, can we start our discussion? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, we're going to do the Q&A. Have people raise their hand.
Okay, great. Okay, should we start there?
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we start there? Can you read them out or come up?
So RJ, the first question is, are there any good reference books out there?
Oh, well, that's a plug for Visionary Press, isn't it? Yeah. I think the question is reference books for what? And so I think that if you want to learn about the history of information graphics or see the history of information graphics, that our books are very specific. Each volume is about a particular visionary who did, something really crazy with data graphics or with information graphics. If you want sort of a more general reference kind of tour, then Sandra Rengen's History of Information Graphics, which is a giant passion book, like that's just really fun because you just turn the pages of that and, each spread has more and more inspiration. It is large and so if you want something that's a little bit more something you can hold in your lap, then I recommend Cartographies of Time, which is, focused on mostly timelines, but different ways to depict time across history. And so Daniel Rosenberg was one of the authors of Cartographies of Time, and he learned about that this thing was discovered. He said, that is not supposed to exist. And so yeah, Cartographies of Time is really wonderful too. It sort of depends, like, what do you want to see? But yeah, contact me directly. One of my favorite activities is like helping people build their own data visualization libraries. Yeah.
The next question is the slight transparency of the red and yellow of the Paris theater map is lovely.
Yes.
Do you know how it was printed? Just overprinting with non-opaque links?
So I'm not an expert on the history of printing. I'm curious if anybody in the room has an opinion. But when we look at these albums, what we'll see is that a lot of the base maps were reused. Okay, so you might find the same map of Paris in another composition, in like another album. And so it's an idea that maybe there's a plate for the base map, and then there is another plate or several plates for the different colors that are being added after the base map is laid down. So I think that's how it happened, but in terms of how they're actually achieving this quality with like what types of inks and that's beyond my expertise. Yes.
Can you say a word about Edward Tufte?
Oh yeah, I could say a lot of words about Edward Tufte. Yeah, so Tufte did a couple of things that were really remarkable, really amazing. So Tufte, so in the late 70s and early 80s, there's like sort of like this group of people who are now sort of all graybeards, and they all have access to basically the same content, which is a lot of this history of information graphics, and they're all reading the same people. They all have like similar references. But Tufte does a couple of things that are really magical. One is that he is able to convey the enthusiasm that group of people had for historic information graphics to a very broad audience. And he did that in a number of ways. One, in the language he used to describe these things. And the second, and this is probably the most important, is the investment he made, right? So he famously mortgages his house in order to print the books the way he wants to print. He does all these like very, very smart entrepreneurial things with his business. For example, he's putting advertisements in all these different publications, right? And he's having, everything's done by mail, right? In 1983, when the first book comes out. And so he has the different like orders from the different ads going to different post boxes so that he knows which ad is more successful. And he's just like really, really like, smart guy, right? And so the risk he took on like mortgaging his house and really going for it and making the book beautiful He had, similar to a couple other people, like this awareness of these items and objects, and to convey that to a much broader audience. I think that, both of those things are really admirable. And that takes us to about 1984, and I think that's enough to say about Edward Tufte for tonight.
So,
Yeah.
I'm thinking about Tufte. I don't know if everybody in the room has ever done a Tufte workshop. But I did one in probably about 20 years ago. And one of the things about Tufte is he was also a collector. Many of the things that those books were in his collection. And when he did the big traveling circus thing he did, where it's like 2 days in a hotel all over the country, he brought books with him, and he had his students walk them down the aisles with white cloth. So I experienced that. Subsequently, about, let's say maybe 10 years ago, he sold his library to Christie. So he's still doing the thing, presumably not with the stuff.
Without the artifacts, yeah.
But he was very much into artifacts, the same way you and I.
Yeah, and so there is some inspiration there. I think like one distinction, one of hopefully many distinctions between me and Tufte is that he wasn't, he's a professor, right? He's at Yale, he's teaching these things, not really a practitioner, right? And so all my work is like looking at the old historic stuff, what worked back then. And it's not just studying the graphics, but actually reading the text. And so, especially because so many of these graphics were so novel, I mean, in 1785, 1786, William Playfair has to explain to you how to read a line graph, how to read a bar chart, because, they're basically, essentially didn't exist before then. And so what you have for a couple, for centuries is not only data graphics, but really cute design essays that were packaged with them. The legend wasn't just this color means this, the legend was a paragraph on how to read it. And so you can learn quite a lot from that. And so my practice is you take all that content, all the historic pre-digital content, and then I take everything that I know to be true from actually working and making graphics today. And what's the overlap? Like, what are the things that hold true and that, that are essentially eternal, right? Because they were true in an analog 1850 age and they're true today. Yeah, and so I think that's hopefully one of many distinctions between me and Tufte. Yeah, go ahead.
Did anything happen in 1992 with him?
Oh, did anything? I don't know exactly what happened in 1992. I think he had a book that came out in the early 90s. Maybe Envisioning Information came out then. I don't know if there's something else that you're thinking of. Yes?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, another thing a little bit about how late. So I see like a lot of the infographics that this conveys is like bar charts or line charts, but this also involving pie charts as well.
Oh, so I don't have a pie chart loaded, but I do have another. Do I have another circular diagram? We'd have to go to a different presentation. So this is not quite a pie chart, right?
Almost. It kind of looks like maybe it's like a half pie chart on this. Circle.
Right. So yeah. So there's two things that would distinguish this from a pie chart. One is that it's only half the pie, but it's actually more than that because this is actually the inversion of a pie chart. So a pie chart and this, which doesn't have a good name. Some people call it the polar area diagram. That's kind of a crappy name. Some people call it a rose diagram. But basically, what does a pie chart do? A pie chart keeps the radius constant and it changes the sector angle. It changes the angle of the wedge. This is doing the opposite. It's keeping the angle constant and it's changing, again, both are changing area, but this is changing area by extending the radius. And so this type of graphic was, most famously not just used, but actually developed by Florence Nightingale. Okay, so Florence Nightingale used a rose diagram or polar area chart to convey mortality statistics from the Crimean War. Yes?
That means that these areas are proportional to the values?
Yeah, so it's not the length of the radius. The areas is proportional to the value, meaning like the amount of ink on the page is proportional to the value. It's not the length of the radius. And that distinction got Nightingale in trouble because the first time she takes a crack with William Farr at making a circular diagram, she encodes the values by the length of the radius. And then they go ahead and they fill in all the gaps, all the area, and people misinterpret it. She gets criticized in public. She issues an errata statement like, no, 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 you're reading the chart wrong. You should read it this way. And guess what? If your audience is reading the chart wrong, it's not their fault. That's your fault. And lucky for Nightingale and Farr, they get another bite at the apple. And so they actually completely change how they encode their data, and they make a new set of diagrams showing the same data. And that new set is the set that becomes iconic. And so like Shea Solomon and like some of these others, we're really, really lucky when it actually takes them a few tries to get it right. We opened with Emma Willard, and Emma Willard's Temple of Time. This was not made out of whole cloth. This is like her. This is after playing with temples of time for, I don't know, maybe like 5, 6, 7 years, and then she makes more temples after this. And so there's a format that's developing that she's trying to refine and learning from. She made this temple, sort of at the intersection of two pressures. One pressure is that Emma Willard is an education pioneer. She's actually in the classroom. She runs an academy, a school for girls. If you don't know the name Emma Willard, she's responsible essentially for, starting education of young women in America. Particularly like a more advanced education, beyond sort of like primary school. And so there's one like sort of pressure, like she's actually in the room with students and understand what can catch students' attention and what can help them actually learn. And a lot of, some of this is memorization learning, sort of like, look at this and make your own version. There's actually manuscript copies of what her students like created, right? As they're mimicking this, often from memory. So that's one pressure. The other pressure is that she's an entrepreneur, just like Tufte. She's trying to sell books. Emma Willard sold over 1 million textbooks in her lifetime. That's a lot of books. We struggle to sell a few thousand. And so you have these two competing pressures that the students, what actually works in a classroom, but also what's going to attract attention in the marketplace and help distinguish her from all the other textbook sellers. Because guess what? Like, public education is a brand new thing in America, right? And there's all these books that are needed. And not only that, but why did she make a graphic about time? She makes a graphic about time because time is changing in America in the 1840s. We have the canal, we have the telegraph, we have the steam engine, right? Space is being compressed. It's rapidly compressing. And information and people and goods can move at a speed which people are not used to, right? And so there's this need to understand how time is now operating. And so this and many other examples of like really, and again, sometimes what I think, like, this is sort of like Nightingale, that I think it's spectacular. It's a spectacular accomplishment. It's completely imitable and not able to be imitated. Like you go home and open Illustrator and try to make this. Good luck. It's really, really hard, to pull this off, especially at any sort of like small scale. We talked a little bit about the iteration of design. We opened the program like showing the floor of this, right? And her floor actually comes from another graphic that she did, which was just that. It was just the floor, and it was it wasn't in perspective. It was a straight on kind of view of history, and it was skinny at the top and wide at the bottom. And like, where did she get that from? Well, she was imitating somebody else actually when she was making that floor, and she's sort of there's sort of like a knockoff off. This is Kirby Ferguson, right? Everything is a remix. But then she takes that graphic, she's like, actually, that's going to be my foundation. I'm going to build a temple on top of it. Really wild stuff. I think it's wild. It's crazy, right? Yeah, it's crazy. It didn't have to be, striped like a rainbow, but it is. There's a version of this. So she did some smaller temples that would fit in a textbook. Much simpler. And she did 4 temples of this size. 3 out of 4 of them are colored. 1 were not I think we concluded that it was sold, but I think there's only one surviving copy in Library of Congress of her black and white temple, and that one actually has like architecture on the floor, and so there's like these little sort of like skeuomorphic buildings on the floor, and then she did one focused on the history of England, and that was a graphic that we thought was lost, and well, I mean, to our knowledge, it was lost, and that's one that we found in an archive. And so that again, there's like sort of, you know, thinking back to Tufte, it's sort of, you know, what did he know about in 1979, 1980, 1981? And he publishes a book about it, and it's sort of like, well, that's like the canon. And, you know, what's so exciting today, and a lot of this starts with David Rumsey, you know, from across town, is the digitization of archives. And so that actually, like, the canon is wonderful. We love the canon. You know, beyond this, I intentionally started with something that was like slightly iconic, but I didn't show you any of the sacred cows, right? And there's lots of sacred cows, and they're wonderful too. But there's so much more. There's so much more that, you know, wasn't on anybody's radar in 1980. Yes.
Another question from online from Stephen Coles. What is missing in current digital graphics that you'd like to see contemporary designers bring back from the past?
Oh man, there's so much. I mean, this is a very cruel way of expressing, but I think today, if you think about data visualization, today we're really good at data. And the visualization is still catching up. Meaning that there are certain achievements that we had that we're still sort of chasing. And like, if you could just imitate it and copy paste like we would, and you can't because of constraints. Like, we're still trying to figure out our constraints. What are the constraints? Like, the primary constraint is this. This is smaller than a piece of cinnamon toast, right? It's so small. And so just like the ceiling is pretty low, unfortunately, because the canvas is so low. And like what walks hand in hand with that is the attention. And like that's, I think that's like, and we've tried, how we tried to solve that? We've tried to solve that with a lot of like what couldn't they do? Well, they had interaction, but the way the way interaction used to work is like you'd move around a graphic. You would zoom in and out with your eye. You would choose what to focus on. There's plenty of interaction. Today we have different types of interaction that they could almost not dream of. You know, where things actually move automatically. You can hover and you can get detail. And a lot of that interaction is really wonderful, but I feel that we've over-indexed on motion, on interaction, and we haven't done enough with static, and like really infusing our static design. And one of the things, you know, I have many talks, and like one of my talks is just about bar charts, and I show like 200 bar charts in 30 minutes. And like what you learn is that, you know, we're only like using, you know, because a lot of these are bespoke graphics, right? They're one-offs, they're sort of like little unicorns, and you really can't imitate them. There's only like what you can learn from them is like, you know, permission to go be nuts. But you know, honestly, especially if we're working in a business context, like you get bar charts, line graphs, pie charts, dots on a map, and that's it. And so one of the things that I think that, you know, we sort of have some catching up to do is how to use those primitive, like sort of basic chart forms in a way that, in a way that like to their maximum utility. And so that's one of the things that I've been trying to do is actually like up my bar chart game, if that makes sense, and have much, like, for example, if you think about a bar chart, you know, you have your axis on the left and your axis on the bottom. And sometimes you have your axis on the right too, like we saw, like feet versus meters, or maybe you double encode it and you have, you know, left and right. But what about on the top? What about on the top of the axis, you know, the attic above? Like whatever you do see there. And so that used to be like real estate that people used, and they put all kinds of information there. So you'd have like axis scales, like imagine the axis scales on the vertical, but then on that top in the attic, they would list out all the values that you're reading. So there's like a little data table. And then, well, if you list them out sideways, and this is going to be cruel. This is going to be cruel to everybody who's, you know, in Zoom. But you know, if you have like this, and you have your here and here, that's normal. You can do that in Excel. And then you have your scatter plot and your values like this. Well, then you can actually list out the values. And we don't like doing things vertically because it's hard to read, but we're gonna go vertically. And do you know why? Because then we can have the summary value here. We can total them all up at the end, right? I mean, this isn't technological, right? But this is just like this is something that this is an idea that, I mean, to me, when I saw it, like, well, that's crazy. And it comes from in 1915. A group of business leaders and government convened for the United States. Like top, like I run this agency, and I run that agency. You know, like this data graphics things, we got to figure this out. And they put together a set of rules. This is how it works. And you know, you can read the rules today, and you can say, well, they have like 19 rules, and 18 of them hold up, and we really haven't added any rules since. Again, you know, you look at something that held true in 1915, and you see that, oh, like it still works today. Well, that's probably how it works. And so this is just a small insight from just one of the many examples from that package of 1915 rules. Yeah. Yes.
Are there any organizations or publications or whatever that you think do a particularly good job with infographics?
Oh, I mean, there's so many that do this. I think like the big one is, so like who's like carried information graphics across the last decade? It's like data journalism, right? Like data journalism, they've done a lot of these, like they have labs, they have experiments, and unfortunately, like what that really means is the New York Times. And I say unfortunately just because of the state of like the winnowing state of journalism in our country. And you know, there's sort of like this, you know, journalism, New York Times is often, it's not quite the tip of the spear, but it's sort of like, you know, the broad part of the spear that does all the business, right? I mean, they just have so much power, and they've been able to endure because of their success. And so you can look at, you know, data journalism, I think generally. And okay, so who else? I think that, you know, National Geographic is also one that particularly with, you know, when I think of information graphics, I think of sort of like a triangle. I think of pictorial diagrams, so stuff without data. And so you think of like, you know, here's the inside of the eye and how the eye works, you know, that kind of thing. I think of statistical charts, stuff like this. And then I think of geographic maps. And, you know, there's like things like kind of like, you know, overlaps in between. So National Geographic is, you know, traditionally has been really strong on maps and really, really strong in pictorial diagrams. They also usually they use charts, I guess, less lovingly, meaning that they're there, but they're usually accessories or very stark or minimal. But in terms of combining maps and pictorial diagrams, like National Geographic is really amazing. But those are like the two easy answers. There's different organizations that have, you know, different businesses, different governments, and I mean, the United States. You know, the Chasson map that we saw, you know, halfway through the presentation is really incredible. Like, but why is it incredible? Well, it's incredible because you have this enormous empire of France financing the data collection and the production of these volumes. You can actually see near the end of the run, like the production quality just sinks just slightly. And like these things are phenomenally expensive. I mean, crude way of understanding modern data graphics is sort of like it springs out of the log books of scientists in the very early kind of English, Scottish Enlightenment. And then like there's sort of a dialogue as these colonial empires, England and France, you know, are trying to conquer the world. And then at the same time, printing technology just becomes absolutely astounding. Think of like, I don't know, like Belle Epoque, sort of like Art Nouveau, you know, posters and like at this, like, and so there's this beautiful rise in national power and artistic, and then World War I hits, and sort of like all the fun gets sucked out of the world. And then what happens after World War I? Like there's this rise in business graphics, and it's because you have the birth of really the modern corporation. And in the 1920s, you have this flurry of data visualization textbooks. And so I own like a stack of these things. And they're all kind of cute in their own ways. But it's all minimal. It's all like really stark minimal graphic. It's stuff that we recognize today. It's stuff that would be like spit out by Excel. And then what you find is as you move through the 20s and you approach World War II, is that a lot of these lessons that came from these like sort of like pre-war empires is have sort of disseminated out. And so you start getting really interesting things coming from beyond like sort of Western Europe and America. And so there's stuff happening in Japan, and there's stuff happening like we saw in Istanbul. And so there's all these like cool things happening, starting to happen all over the world. And like that's just one perspective of understanding kind of like the history. You know, data graphics are older than written language, right? The first pictures, you know, the first information pictures we ever made were maps of the stars. Like that's like older than, you know, before we had written language, we're making data tables to like we have this much grain and I sold this much grain to this person, right? So there's tables of data. Like, you know, this is it's a human thing that isn't owned by any particular country or tradition. It's just one way of understanding sort of like how we got, you know, the particular sort of rigid, you know, like why are these defaults in my computer? You know, and like to understand like that like tradition, then you can look at it through like a very Western lens. Yeah. So that's who's doing really good data graphics. Yes.
Compared to this one, I have a question about the one that with the states, like 2 examples after this. Is it that one I could not understand why the decision was made? The next one, I think.
This one?
Yeah. So why they do it in a circular pattern, and then this one in particular, I just don't know if they try to scale by the area or by the radius.
Yeah, that's actually a good question. So I've actually made this. And so I've made this, and so I should be able to tell you the answer. And when I say I made it, I mean so there's a website charts.infowetrust.com where I remake some of these things from scratch, mostly to keep coding skills kind of like up to snuff. But I remade this one, and I believe that this is encoded by the radius, not the area. I could be misremembering that. I have to look at the code to see how it's done. So, but to answer your first question, which I think is more interesting, is that this is from a book like this thick, has hundreds of data graphics. And so if you turn every page and every one is a rectangular bar chart, you're going to go numb. Like what's actually important is that the visual forms are being varied, the color palettes are being varied, and you'll see that as you read through this book, you'll see that, you know, there's like there's certain flow and rhythm to the volume. So, you know, this chart doesn't like on the screen. And so like, what's the problem today? Well, on the screen, like all you see is this, right? But if you're holding a book, you see the whole page automatically, right? And you're going to see the whole page, which doesn't mean you can't focus on that single graphic, but also you know it's in a book and that's in a context with more than that. It's very, very difficult in a small canvas and on a website to have any sort of context. But there's loads of context here.
So is the table on the right is the source data for the graph?
Yes, yeah, and that runs through the whole book. And this is a tradition that you'll see through many data graphic publications, is that they're always also providing you with the data table.
And what's important is that it's in one view.
Yeah.
This is what you can't do on a phone. Because in this graphic, I can look at the table and refer back and forth. And that's important.
Yeah, and there's some really nice things being done with, I mean, just, you know, we just did a kind of like a live breakdown of the table, but, you know, these are chunked into 5, you know, groups of 5, and that just helps your eye, right? If this is just all, I think there's, this is 1923, I don't know if that's
It's well designed tabular matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the conflict between the length versus the area is that this chart doesn't have to be continuous. It can be just bar up being planned out. And that would give you more accurate visualization. But
right. If that indeed, again, I don't exactly remember how it's encoded. We'd have to look at charts.infotrust.com. Yeah.
You have a comment about the infographics of USA Today?
Oh, Yeah, so I mean, so Nigel Holmes, I think you're talking about Nigel Holmes' work. So Nigel Holmes is a mentor and an inspiration. And so I think that Nigel was somebody who Edward Tufte. Nigel was one of many people that Edward Tufte used his power to pick on, which is one of the many reasons why people disdain Edward Tufte. Nigel is first a very nice person, which is also a distinction from Edward Tufte, but also an enormously creative person. So Nigel Holmes is running graphics at Time Magazine, and he's famous for making absolutely joyous and cheerful graphics, even when they're about hard topics. And what is he doing that somebody like Tufte isn't? He actually has an audience who he has to attract their attention. He has to sustain that attention, engage them, and he has to try to inform them. And he's actually doing that, and he's part of a tradition at Time Magazine. And so there's here's another plug. And so I love the domain charts. So I also have charts.substack.com, and we just completed a series looking at the first couple of decades of information graphics in Time Magazine. And what's really interesting is the Time Magazine starts in like 1924, 25, 26, just a couple of years after this. And for the first decade of Time Magazine itself is not publishing data graphics. They'll occasionally throw a map into a story. Where all the data graphics are in the ads. And so there's these like batshit crazy ads from Time Magazine for a decade. And then at a certain point, they start staffing up and they actually start poaching people from other magazines in order to create graphics. And that happens like 1937, just in time to sort of like pull together a crew as we go into World War II. And in World War II, people understood what was happening, right, according to what Time Magazine was telling them every week. And so this group of people, which are also headed by a husband and wife pair, just like the NOIRAS and the Isotype Institute, they would get their brief. They'd get their brief on Thursday afternoon, kind of like a story meeting, and they'd have like 6 graphics, like big graphics that they'd want to produce, and then by Monday they'd have like the finals submitted for I think 3 or 4 of them that like actually made it to final cut. They'd work for like 3 days straight, like to produce all these graphics. And like how do you do that? Well, they were really smart. So what they would do is they would develop like these they had like these giant globes on that were hanging from the ceiling that they can control in 3 axes. So they'd have these globes and they'd take a perspective shot of whatever area of the world they wanted, right? Photography, and then they would take that and then they could illustrate it, right? But they're like, it's a lot of work. And so what they do is they start building a library of different parts of the world. And in particular, before Guadalcanal, what they're doing is they're tracking the US Army and they're trying to figure out, Time Magazine trying to figure out, where are we invading next? What's the next island? And they're actually making the right guesses, right? And so when something happens in World War II, Time Magazine can just run, what they do is they already have the map developed that they need for that, random island in the Pacific. And then what they can do is they can just layer, the troop movement arrows and the typeface like on top, and then boom, and publish it. And so everybody's getting this information like effectively in real time, right? Yeah. Anyway, so Nigel Holmes comes into Time Magazine, and the graybeards when Nigel starts are those people, and so that's who he's learning from. And then what is Nigel learning? It's got color. It's got color, right? So these 1940s, you get 1, you get 2 color. They do kind of interesting stuff, mostly with red. Sometimes they have gray and white, black and white compositions with like a yellow spot color, and so you have a yellow highlight on a grayscale. It's like really funky, like very simple, but something you just don't see today. Like I don't know if it's screens or what, but there's just not enough yellow. There's just not enough happy yellows. Yeah, so so I'm a big there's Nigel has one thing with these arrows, like hands as arrows that are like swoopy in different colors, and just absolutely wonderful. Yeah, he has a book that came out maybe a year and a half ago called Joyful Infographics, and that's really wonderful. And then he's currently working on a book about the relationship between exercise and being physically fit. and being a creative, and how those two things are very important. I mean, Nigel, I don't know how old he is, but maybe 80 years old. I don't know. He's like, he's up there. And so, but he's just as spry and energetic, and and he attributes a lot of that to his exercise. And so he's really important about that. Yeah. Yes.
I was curious, for instance, on that time magazine, what the people that work there study to, what background did you have?
Oh yeah. So today people arrive to information graphics from different places. They're designers, they're engineers, often they're architects. We kind of live in an age where we don't build a lot, which is a problem. And so a lot of architects, a lot of like as famous as an information designer can be today is probably somebody like George Lupi, who's an architect. And so there's that's where people came from. If you look at the history, what you find is that there's a name attached to a graphic, and that name is some sort of like powerful personality. And often, like, I don't know, Florence Nightingale, and it's not their hands actually doing the work, right? They have like workshops of elves actually doing the work. Or maybe they're making sketches, but then they're handing that off. So the people actually doing the work are professional draftsmen, lithographers, and so the idea that but even though this is from an analog age, don't think it's not a product of machine technology. Like, it's just analog machinery that are churning out a lot of this stuff. And that's not always true. But what you find is it's not somebody who, I'm an information graphics person, and so I'm doing this. It's people who kind of like stumble into it because they need to do it for a certain reason. It's like that story about, how do you, like the professor who assigned, who's teaching a pottery class and like splits the class. And so this class, you just turn in one vase at the end, and, I will grade you based on the quality of your final vase, right? And then this side, I just want you to make a shit ton of vases. And the number of vases, like the more vases you make, like the better, like the higher grade will be. Like almost like I'm just going to weigh them, right? And that'll and like, who makes the better vase? Like this, like the people who make 1,000 vases, not the people who focus on like going into their cave and trying to make a masterpiece. And so it's sort of like similar that like it's just not people who are just setting out to make something spectacular. It's just like they have a weird need and a weird set of skills. And so scientists and educators and politicians, I mean, all like people from across society, were making these things, aeronauts, and all kinds of different people were making these, and using them for different purposes, right? And so there's a whole another presentation where it's like data graphics for, social reform. So the data graphics, have you seen like the pictures of, what's the color of suffrage? Getting the vote for women, it's white, right? Yeah. And so women would march, 48 women or however many, and they'd be dressed in either white or black, and they'd march in the formation of the states, right? And they'd be like each one would represent whether the state had been, given the vote or not. And so there's like all kinds of like, wild ways, but none of those people were chart designers, right? Like these are just, purposing this particular tool for a certain end. Yeah. I'm sorry, I saw your hand a few minutes ago and I didn't get to it.
Yeah, I was just going to comment about this chart.
Yeah.
Exactly like circular. I think it's the space issue too. And this out in the rock chart.
Yeah.
Putting it on page, so
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that that's like, the lessons from modern practice would be the, one of the tricks that I have is putting things in a semicircle in what Eric Carle would call a dome. Like there's sort of, the top of a circle is the dome and the bottom is the bowl. So you use a dome shape, and like, why is that? Well, one, it's interesting. It's like it creates an object of focus, but also like it lets you compress more information, like you just said, and it also lets you do something that, I mean, you can do this rectangularly, but it's actually like you can give some sort of like hierarchy, right, to the information. What's on the inside and the outside? Is being on the inside or the outside, does that have sort of meaning? That seems to have like more meaning than being on the top or the bottom. No, not more meaning, has a different meaning, right? And so you can use that too. Yeah, I totally agree. Information compression. Yeah. So we have like, a bunch of these in the back. And like, I think it'd be fun, to, oh yeah, one more question.
Linden, I tried looking her up.
Oh yeah, you wouldn't find a lot of these people. Do you know why? Because we're just still figuring all this out.
Yeah.
But so it's Paulette Lacore, Corre, Lydon, Lydon, or Lydon, and then she went by Pol, Pol. But there's like I think, is it a circumflex, like the hat on top of the O? I mean, yeah, yeah, there she is. But the person who knows the most about her is Jason Forrest. Pol did publish a book at the very end of her career, and I've been looking for it for years. I have a PDF of it, but she did publish a book on like, this is how it works. She's one of several. I mean, Florence Nightingale is a famous woman, but there's dozens of women who did data graphics, like even before World War One. And there's a certain connection there. So you can think of the first computers were women, right? Women are involved with computing technology from the very beginning. Computers come from textile industry originally, and then Babbage and onward. Nightingale worked with William Farr, who was England's top statistical talent. And at the same time that Farr started working with Nightingale, he started working with the Schutz engine. The Schutz engine was the first piece of working machine technology. And he got the second engine. And so it's basically a working analytic Babbage engine. And so the first Schutz engine went to America and was used for celestial observations, and then the second one went to Farr. And so at the same time that they have this like crazy clockwork kind of contraption doing machine technology. And this is 1850, late 1858, long time ago. And so women, computers, machines, they've been with us for a long time. I think we're at time, at least for the Zoom, but everybody in the room, let's, if everyone can hang out, we'll go to the back and we'll look at some of the real stuff.
For coming a little late. I was amazing. Go. Yeah, I took a class on information design before. I didn't have a lot of involvement thinking, data charts, like line charts, pie charts. Me personally, I usually like the pie charts the best. They're great. I'm looking my two business goals are based on ratings. I'll get another accurate.